Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Hello, and welcome to a very special Scary Stories NYC. Some of you who've been following us or other Scary Stories channels on YouTube know about how we and some other channels have mass deleted many of our videos. Some of them because of YouTube's changing policies, and some because of companies more aggressively claiming copyright over public domain footage in our shows. We have drastically fewer videos for you to look at right now, so it's been a priority for me to get as many of our better stories back online in animated versions, with audio and visuals all created by me as soon as possible. This, as with everything anyone does on the internet, has drawn complaints. Haven't I heard this story before? It's possible, but it's still the only place on YouTube you can hear it. We don't do reruns. We do, however, restore deleted episodes. Recently, a Japanese company made a false copyright claim over some of the background footage for our most famous story, Bigfoot Attacked My Tiny House. We have a book you can buy on Amazon by the same name. So, I took the opportunity presented by fate and went back to the original audio by PQ Ribber, creating an all-new version of the story with new mixing, and then I got Dr. Death himself to appear as the narrator on screen. Each of the stories in this episode were created in that way, going back to the original audio recordings of the readings and mixing modern animated versions for 2019 viewers. If you can find these stories elsewhere on YouTube, then that's someone violating our copyright. Without further ado, let's kick it off with our first scary story.
Bigfoot attacked my tiny house, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. A few years back, when I was in high school, I had a girlfriend who liked housey shows on TV. I was bored by all of them, except if it was about tiny houses. I liked the idea of having a little home, but I didn't understand who also bought property to put them on. I think if you're going to have a tiny home, make it portable. Instead of buying property, get a vehicle to move your tiny house around with. Now, all of America's your backyard. When I started senior year, Dad took me aside and told me he'd been putting away money for my college and to get me a car when I graduated high school. All it amounted to, though, was around $100,000. That might cover most of tuition, but not pay for a car. Dad said maybe I should consider a state college, then I could also have my books and expenses covered and get a car in the deal. But I told Dad I didn't want to go to college. I told him I wanted to own a mobile, tiny house instead. He ignored me and told me we'd speak about it again in a month. In a month, I had budgeted out everything for my tiny house. It had a porta-potty semi-attached, and it had solar panels in the roof and a gas-powered generator for when I needed to recharge my phone or tablet. My dream is to be a writer, so why do I need to go to school? With a portable tiny house, America would become my school. Every second of every day would be an adventure. I made my strongest pitch to Dad, who looked at me as though I were suggesting eating the cat for dinner. Needless to say, senior year for me was one family argument after another. Dad tried yelling at me, ignoring me, saying undermining things to invalidate my feelings, and he even slapped me once for saying a tiny house would leave me free from rent. "Rent is a good thing," he screamed. "It teaches responsibility. It builds moral character because it keeps you from living your life willy-nilly." All year long, Dad tore into me, and all year long, I neglected to apply for any colleges, and I focused on shop class. I felt my freedom depended on me being able to build my own home, so I became a pretty good carpenter and electrician, although I wasn't actually licensed for that. When I started building parts of the house using my own money, Dad caved in and agreed I could follow my dream. He and Mom tried to then talk me into building a permanent tiny house that could essentially exist in their backyard and would tap into their electricity. That, to me, would defeat the entire purpose of what I was doing. My parents were terrified of the idea of me being parked in random, sketchy places where I could be exposed to all kinds of danger. Dad was concerned about car accidents and animal attacks, while Mom was convinced that just behind every tree line across America were roving gangs of illegal drug growers armed with machine guns and roofies. I told them to get Google Latitude and friend me, then they could always spot me on GPS. "What good will that do?" my mother cried hysterically. "Give us the location where you died so we could go erect a marker?" After a while, Dad got more used to the idea and even would join in and help me build it on weekends. We got a used pickup truck on the cheap from my Uncle Edgar and managed to make it all real for only about $80,000. That left me $20,000 of food and gas until I had to find new revenue streams. The first place I wanted to visit was Austin, Texas, so I taught my parents how to find me on GPS and split, driving southward. I would be lying if I told you this wasn't the most fun time of my entire life. I would go find out where the good bands played when they hit smaller towns and get to see them for less money and more intimate settings. I would meet awesome girls. I actually loved them and left them, just like guys in the old movies. I think it was probably about an hour from Austin when I pulled over and stopped on the side of a lovely forest road because it dawned on me that I hadn't smoked a doob in nearly 10 hours. I rifled through my stuff, looking for my lighter and everything, when I remembered I had left them in the house. I usually don't go inside without detaching it from the truck and setting it on solid ground, but this didn't really feel like a good place to do that, and all I wanted was a quick hit. I got out of the truck and walked to the front door, which was facing the rear. I climbed up and used my key to open the door, and then I heard the strangest sound from the trees across the road. Something was up in the branches, thrashing them about. Was it a bird, a group of birds? It was just starting to get dark, and that made it harder to see as I squinted up at the branches. Some kind of squeaking sound was coming from there. Was it a chirping sound? It had never occurred to me that this might be anything dangerous, so I jumped down away from the house door and walked over to the trees, squinting up at the source of the disturbance. It was monkeys. 2 little monkeys playing in the tree, out here in the middle of nowhere. I took one step off the road into the undergrowth, and something large and black swatted me in the face and upper chest, causing me to fly backwards 10 or 15 feet, then skid on my bottom until my back slammed hard into the wheel of my truck. As bad as that hurt, my backside hurt 10 times worse and felt like it was on fire. I stood up screaming in pain, and then my scream was drowned out by a deafening roar emanating by the largest, most terrifying man I have ever seen in my life. He was not an ape or a gorilla. He was a man who was 8 or 9 or 10 feet tall and covered in fur everywhere but his face. His features were Caucasian with a very big nose, but he looked somehow brain damaged and drooled on himself. His skin was black, like ebony wood, like black leather. His teeth seemed long and sharp, and his eyes glowed red. My head was in shock, but my body scrambled into the front seat of the truck and started the engine. The sound of the truck starting seemed to further anger the crazy, messed-up-looking giant man-monster, and he ran into my beautiful tiny home as I started to drive away. This made me spin a bit, and I almost drove off the road. The monster was screaming and slamming into my home as I tried to accelerate, and I could hear wood and glass breaking behind me. Eventually, I got away and couldn't hear any more destruction back there. I drove and drove until I found a gas station before getting out to assess the damages. Half the house had been torn off. Half the house was just gone, and most of what remained was trashed. There was no way I could afford to fix it on my own. I would need to get a good deal from my insurance people. And of course, That did not happen. Somehow, since they did not believe my story about Bigfoot, they decided I had done this to my house myself. They never explained exactly how I could have done any part of it, but they didn't give me a dime, and my dream of living free died because of that obnoxious, idiotic Bigfoot. These days, I work at a gas station and live in my parents' basement. Every single day they lecture me about how I flushed away my college money and ruined their lives. Their lives! They don't have to work at the gas station. I listen to everything I can find about Bigfoot. I hate that thing so much. I hear some people think he's a bipedal ape or gorilla. Some think he's Gigantopithecus. Some think he's a space alien, and some think Bigfoot is a tribe of ancient humans. But I think I know best what Bigfoot is. Bigfoot is a total jerk-ass. Screw you, Bigfoot! Bigfoot and Poltergeists, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ River. Dear Scary Stories, I'm a 24-year-old guy living in eastern Oklahoma, in a little town that's practically inside the Ouachita National Forest. Basically, they cut down some trees, put in a road, and that's our town. This story happened back in the summer of 2005 when I was 12 years old. It all started one day when my younger sister and I were out playing catch in our backyard. She's a year and a half younger, so I guess she was 10 or 11 at the time. The yard was a patchy lawn that our dogs crapped all over, and it was surrounded on 3 sides by trees that contained the Shawnee River. If you set off walking in those trees, eventually you'd reach the National Forest, which is technically the next state over. But trees don't care about state lines, and this forest extended from Arkansas clear on up to our backyard. Anyway, the ball got away from my sister, and she ran back to the tree line to fetch it. As she bent over to get the ball, I saw the tallest, darkest, most naked man I'd ever seen in my life just stand up out of nowhere in a bush right in front of her. She couldn't see because she was bent down, but I screamed like I never screamed before or since. And when she stood up, she could also see what I was screaming about. She dropped the ball and ran back to me. Holding each other's hands, we ran into the house and double-locked the back door, panting. Our mama asked us what we were making so much noise about, and when we told her, she just laughed and said something about our imaginations. Then she told us we'd better not tell our dad about it or he'd give us a spanking with his belt for being liars. What she really meant is that he would give us a whooping for scaring him, because my daddy knows my sister and me don't lie, but my daddy's scared of the boogity man. Anyway, we had dinner that night after Dad got home, and we didn't bring up the boogity man at all. That didn't stop something crazy from happening, though. In the middle of eating, Daddy asked me to pass the salt, but before I could, the salt shaker itself flew off the table and whacked him in the forehead. My mom, my sister, and I all screamed at the same time, and I think my scream was the highest pitched of all. Mom dragged him out to the car. He was awake but staggering and groggy, and she drove him on down to the hospital at the Veterans Center. As soon as they left, my sister asked me, "How did you do that?" I got angry at her. "You know I didn't throw the salt shaker. I didn't even touch it. If you go saying I threw it, I'll get the whooping of my life, and then I'll find a way to get even with you." She calmed me down. "I ain't going to tell on you," she said. "I know you didn't touch it. I got eyes. I thought you used your magic Kitty Pryde super mutant powers to throw it at him." "It's not funny," I shouted. "Daddy's at the hospital. Remember what happened the last time he had to go to the hospital?" She looked glum. "We couldn't afford meat for the rest of the year," she said, as she started to clear off the table, adding sadly, "I guess that chicken in the freezer is the last meat we're going to taste till we're grown up." When Mama brought Dad back from the hospital, he had a red mark in the shape of a salt shaker on his forehead, and my sister and I had to stifle our laughing because this was not a funny situation. Daddy gave us a speech that didn't really make a lot of sense, and we both tried to keep looking in his eyes instead of at his forehead. Then we was sent off to bed without a spanking. So that, I thought, was that. Trouble is, it wasn't that. It was only the beginning. It wasn't the next night, but a few nights later that once again, during dinner, something flew across the room. This time it was the butter dish, and it slammed itself along with the last of our butter that we were going to be able to afford for some time, smack into the wall. At least we don't have to bring the wall to the hospital, I cracked, and immediately regretted it. I didn't get to eat my dinner, and I had to clean up the wall and floor now. This time, Daddy's lecture made a little more sense, and he was a little more than angry at me, but the red mark on his head was turning all sorts of colors now, green and blue and purple, so I just passed the time while he lectured, studying his injury. From then on, every single week there was at least one incident. It often happened at dinner, but one time when we came home from church on Sunday, we saw Grandma's old crucifix on the ground in front of the house and a hole in one of our front windows that it must have flown through. Daddy's car keys kept disappearing and then reappearing in nonsense places like the refrigerator. Finally, he started keeping them taped to his body under his pants. When they disappeared from there, he went and called on a spiritual shaman-type guy from down where the Choctaw live. He was an old man. I forget his name, but he died soon after that, like the next year or year after that, I think. He asked us to tell him everything that happened in order. When we were done, he told us that we were leaving something out. He said something has to have happened first, before these incidents. There has to have been something that triggered it. He asked us if we'd seen any spirits in the sky or in the forest before the poltergeist activity began. My sister and I both gasped and looked at each other and then at our parents. Should we risk telling the story? We might get punished for it. Maybe it wasn't worth it. The shaman sensed what was going on and asked to speak to us kids alone, which my parents consented to. We told him about the giant naked man that had terrified us just before this all started, and he told us we had narrowly escaped being captured and eaten. He said that kind of wild man of the woods eats children. He told us that out of spite for denying him a meal, he must have placed a curse on us by afflicting an invisible parasite to us that was now terrorizing the family with poltergeist activity. We asked the wise man what we could do, and he told us not to worry about it, that he would tell our parents how to handle things, and he promised not to tell them our secret. I remember he did some kind of ritual involving smoke and walking around muttering stuff. He had a long conversation with Mama and Daddy, and then left, and I never saw him again. I never saw the Boogedy Man again, and our poltergeist went away, too. I guess it's a story that doesn't have much of an ending, but believe you me, that was a good enough ending for my family, and we had had enough of that ghost, or whatever it was. Since then, I've read up on poltergeists, and I'm just glad my parents didn't know anything about them back then. It turns out the main theory about them is that they are really tween kids using their mutie powers somehow. If my daddy thought I was throwing stuff around with my mind, he'd have beat me so hard I'd still be feeling it today. I think that's a terrible theory, to blame a kid for stuff that's going on that he or she couldn't possibly be responsible for. The only poltergeist I ever experienced personally was most definitely not caused by kids going through puberty. It was caused by Bigfoot. We'll be back with another story for you in a second. The Bigfoot of the Bronx, as told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. Ribber. My grandmother grew up in the Bronx back in the 1930s and 40s on a farm, believe it or not. She told me the small farmhouse she was born and grew up in was the only one on the block in those days, and that a tributary of the Bronx River ran through the farm in the back. They did not have running water, and it was her job as a kid to go get water from the river and bring it into the house. The bathroom was an outhouse. They didn't have a refrigerator, but they did have an ice box, which was basically just a box with a big chunk of ice under it or over it, or something that you could keep stuff cold in. I'm not sure how it worked. She had a regular refrigerator by the time I was in the picture. Grandma told me that other than going to school, she virtually never left the farm when she was young, as they had most of their essentials delivered. Milk came delivered before she woke up every morning. The iceman delivered ice. The fruit man pushed his fruit cart down the block daily. And there even was a man who came at least once a week with a cart to sharpen scissors and knives. So in the summer, her life was basically to get up at dawn, milk the cow and goat, feed the chickens, and tend the crops. After dinner, she was allowed to listen to 1 half-hour radio program. Then it was time for bed, and the whole process began again the next day. She told me this information over and over as I grew up, usually following it with a lecture about how easy my generation had it by comparison. I would put up with these boring stories because every so often she'd trot out her good story, the one about the wild man. That was a story I could not hear enough of, and I would never tire of. Story always started with Grandma talking about how one night in the early 40s she woke up to the sound of a rifle being fired right outside her bedroom window. Rushing out of the house, she found her father holding his smoking rifle, staring into the forest behind the farm, ranting in German about a man trying to steal their chickens. Grandma noticed the chicken coop was in fact broken into, and she immediately set about nailing a board over the hole that the chickens were trotting out of. After repairs, she and her dad counted heads and discovered the one chicken was missing. The next night, Grandma slept straight through, but when she got up, she found the chicken coop broken into again, and all but 2 hens and the rooster were completely gone. She woke up her dad, who had also slept through the entire incident, and was angry about it. Her mom was too ill to help them, so Grandma and her dad started taking daytime naps when they could, and took turns at night standing watch over the farm with the rifle at their side. Nothing happened for almost a week. Then the man came back, this time for their goat. Grandma says she was sitting on the back porch on her watch when she must have dozed off because the sound of the goat bleating woke her from her slumber. It was not bleating as though we were frightened. It was bleating the sound it made when welcoming one of the family. Assuming her dad was up, she began apologizing for having nodded off and semi-stumbled in her exhausted state toward the goat. She noticed that her dad was untying the animal, and she started asking him why he was doing that when her thoughts were interrupted by the loudest scream she said she had ever heard in her life. It was a roar, a bellow, and a scream, all rolled into one. The sound was so forceful that it felt like someone had punched her in the chest, and she took a step backwards, almost falling down from the sheer power of it. That set the goat to screaming in fright, and the chickens and dogs and half the forest animals as well. Staring at the figure she now realized was not her dad, she tried to focus her eyes and comprehend what was standing before her. It did look like a man, but a very tall one, and he was naked, too. I was a big fan of Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of, and so I would try to get Grandma to admit she'd seen Bigfoot. She, on the other hand, preferred to refer to it as a him, and in her mind, he was a caveman of some sort. I showed her drawings of Bigfoot, but she said this was not a monkey. He was not covered in fur. He was covered in hair, and to her there was a major difference between the two. She said it was dark, and she really couldn't make out the face too well. But she, at the time, did not think at all of apes or gorillas. She thought she was face to face with a giant caveman, and she was terrified. Deciding she was no threat, the hairy man took the leash of the goat and turned to walk into the forest with it. Realizing her family could not afford to lose that goat is what Grandma says gave her the courage to fire her rifle just over the man's head. She said he was so immense that she didn't think a rifle shot would take him down, so she hoped the sound would scare him off instead. It worked. He dropped the goat leash and returned to the forest in a hurry, making very little noise. Her father had been awakened by the noise and got outside just in time to see the tall man disappear into the woods. The next day her dad brought a large supply of barbed wire and metal fencing, and the two of them spent the day fencing in their entire property. She claimed her dad hooked up a gas-powered motor to a Rube Goldberg device he had built himself so that at night the fence was electrically charged. It made a terrible racket, cost too much in terms of gas to power the engine, and succeeded only in electrocuting 2 squirrels and a bird. They turned off the engine for good after the 4th night, but the giant caveman that I think was really Bigfoot never came back. I've searched on Google, and as far as I can tell, this is my first, last, and only report of a Bigfoot-type creature in the Bronx, and it happened within the last 100 years. Determined to find Bigfoot bones, all through my childhood I would spend summer days at my grandma's house digging up holes in her backyard while she watched her soap operas. I dug up a musket ball one time, which showed her that her yard had either been a hunting ground or the site of a battle. On other occasions I discovered a dragonfly fossilized in shale and impressions of an ancient fern plant in a stone. I never discovered even chicken bones, let alone Bigfoot bones, but each dig was the most exciting adventure of my life. Knowing I was investigating an area that Bigfoot had once called home, or at least migrated through, made every second last 10 minutes for me and every color and scent brighter and sharper. I have never seen a Bigfoot or really anything strange at all in my entire life, but in my mind I relived my grandma's harrowing tale over and over as though I had been there myself. I would stand there where she stood and imagine the giant hairy man was still there before me, standing where she said he stood. In the 1990s, Grandma died, and my parents sold our house to a family who I told Grandma's Bigfoot stories to, as well as my stories of things I had dug up back there. They were unimpressed and quickly paved over the backyard, covering the entire former farm, and erected a basketball court over it. No idea who owns it now, but I doubt they have any idea of the adventures that took place on that property back in the old days when people still had a direct connection to the land. I'm sure they have no idea at all that they live on the very spot where Bigfoot was once seen, in the Bronx. Dogman in the Bronx. As told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. This is the true story of how I saw a Dogman in the Bronx. I know it sounds impossible, but you should know that since upstate New York has been overdeveloped with a huge infestation of rich people, a lot of the wildlife from up there has traveled down to our neck of the woods to live. Raccoons now regularly rummage through the garbage all the way down to Washington Heights and Upper Manhattan. In 2015, a coyote was captured by the police in Battery Park City. That's as far south as you can go in Manhattan, one of the most modern cities on the planet. I can't explain to you how these creatures migrate down from upstate except to guess that they must leave the parks and green areas to walk south through city streets or maybe through the sewers or over the rooftops. If you look at maps, you could see that there's no way to walk entirely through green or wooded areas from upstate south through the Bronx, let alone down into Manhattan. Also, the creatures would need to walk over bridges without being noticed, or else they'd have to swim across, one or the other. In my opinion, all the coyotes that live in Van Cortlandt parks and the Botanical Gardens shouldn't be captured and let out again upstate. They should be tagged with GPS devices so we can figure out how they get around. Did you ever see that Will Smith movie about Manhattan after the zombie apocalypse, when computer-animated lions roam free hunting game on Park Avenue? The sightings of coyotes make me feel strongly that we're a lot closer to that reality already than most people might ever guess. Okay, so this happened one day about 6 years ago when I was off from work and I decided to wander over to the Twin Lakes in the Botanical Gardens to hang out. It had been a place I loved as a kid, but I hadn't been there for at least a dozen years. It's really just one tiny lake. The second one is mostly dried up. On maps they still draw both lakes, but they must have copied those drawings from Leif Erikson or something, because that second lake has always been a mud patch, even since I was very young. We used to come here to catch crayfish, which are basically tiny lobsters or large water bugs or something in between. We'd have caught fish if there were any, but as I said, the place was mainly dried up and a remnant of the natural wonderland that the Bronx must once have been. Still, catching a crayfish made me feel like I was a real nature boy, like Opie on the TV, so I came back to the Twin Lakes every chance I could as a child. This time when I went back to visit a few years back, I noticed the bridge between the lakes was now a small parking lot, but that the rest of it was essentially the same ugly mess I remembered and loved it for being when I was younger. Yes, it's surrounded by highways, and yes, it's filthy, but it was the closest thing to a patch of nature we had, so we loved it. I still loved it as I stood there, and I took a deep breath of air, and then choked it back out as I realized I had breathed in fumes from the exhaust of a passing diesel truck. Maybe the gas fumes started melting my brains, but I swear to you that the next thing that happened was I saw something move in the brush across the lake. I was standing on the parking lot bridge and facing roughly north, and on the north side of the lake emerged a figure walking up to the water. It was later in the afternoon, and the sun had started going down, but it was far from dark, and I could make out the figure pretty plainly. It was a hairy, naked man with the head of a dog. It was Dogman. I let out a gasp, and I think it heard me because it stopped walking toward the lake and stood staring at me. I stared back, and without moving an inch, it bared its teeth, and even at that distance I could hear it growl. I stared back at it in shock until I remembered that wild dogs don't like to be looked in the eyes, and they take it as a challenge. Terrified, I looked down and averted my eyes, then almost immediately got angry at myself for being a chicken. I looked up again, but the creature had taken that split second to back away into the bushes. I saw it take one final backward step, eyes still locked on me as it disappeared into the bushes and trees on the north side of the lake. Idiotically charged with adrenaline, I ran to my left, through the parking lot bridge, and took a right terracing down the lake and into the patch of forest beyond, looking for the thing. I had my phone out and was ready to snap a photo if I saw the creature again, but I didn't see any animals or people over there at all. I did run into some sort of Santeria-looking thing. Someone had painted a weird symbol on a rock in the ground, and there were little pieces of paper rolled up and stuck in the branches of trees all around the rock. I probably should have taken a picture of this ceremonial site, but something told me not to. Growing up in this area, I was taught never to mess with other people's religious beliefs. Wandering around a little bit more and finding nothing, I eventually got bored and went home to Google about the Dogman and email some of my friends about it. Most seemed to think I was just joking. The next day at work, two of my buddies took me to lunch so they could hear the full story. One friend, who happens to be a white guy, felt that I'd seen a rare but natural creature, probably native to upstate like the coyote, who was leaving the forest to drink water from the lake. My other friend, who happens to be Hispanic, felt strongly that I had seen a brujo, or shapeshifter, a male witch or a shaman. He didn't think the shrine in the woods was related to his appearance, being that of a wolf man, but he thought it was possible that the shrine had been created by the shape-shifting witch man for other purposes. Then again, it may have been created by any number of people, as the area is quite heavily populated by those who still practice the old customs. I don't know if I can accept the concept of a shapeshifter, but it would explain why nobody else has reported seeing such a creature in this area. Maybe he only appears in that form occasionally, then can change back to human form to walk home. Or maybe it was a real natural creature, and it just got here using the same secret pathways the coyotes and raccoons use, which we humans are still unaware of. The lesson I learned from this experience is that the world is a lot more mysterious than any of us think, and that even in the most overpopulated urban areas, nature reigns eternally supreme. Fog of Old New York, as told to Peter Bernard, read by River. I live on the west side of Manhattan, and I've had two very strange experiences relating to fog. I'll tell you one now, save the other for later. So I live in a fairly tall building and my apartment faces east. I have a friend who lives in a shorter apartment building east of here, and I can actually see into his west-facing window on a clear day. We discovered this once by accident while on a phone call together. I'm far enough away that I can't really make out facial features, but if he stands in his window and I zoom in on him with my phone camera, I can get a pretty clear view of his shape. During the day I can even make out what color shirt he has on. He actually bought a shade and painted a picture of himself standing in the window on the outside of it as a joke for me in case I ever tried to spy on him. I can't remember how I know he did that, but anyway, one foggy day in New York town, I realized I couldn't see my friend's window at all. In fact, I couldn't even see his building. Everything past Fifth Avenue appeared pure white, as though nothing existed beyond it. I called my friend on the phone. Let's call him Al. When he answered, I acted relieved. "Oh, Al, it's so great to hear your voice. I thought you were lost forever." "What the hell are you talking about, moron?" he blurted out, annoyed. "Well, since we separated into alternate dimensions," I responded. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to reach you by cell phone any longer. "Dude, I got no time for the Riddler today. Can we skip to the part where Robin uses the Bat computer to solve the riddle?" "Look out your window, Batman. I've got a surprise for you." I waited a moment as I heard Al groan and get up, and then walk over to the window and gasp, "Holy crap, you really did go into another dimension for me, dude." "Would I lie to you?" I asked. And then as he was about to answer the question, I talked over him fast and loud. "Hey, if cell phone communication still functions between the dimensions, do you think physical transportation is possible, as in bipedal locomotion?" "You're welcome to try bipedaling yourself over here, but I'm not going anywhere today," he told me unequivocally, explaining, "I'm only like an hour and a half into binge-watching Wonderfalls." That threw me, and I had only begun formulating a clever way of admitting that I had no idea what Wonderfalls was when he suggested, "Hey, you can bring over some of that liquid your dimension is so known for. What's it called again?" "Oh, right, beer." "Mission accepted," I responded and disconnected the call, throwing the phone in the pocket of my hoodie and heading out to meet my fate or destiny, or in other words, to go visit the 7-Eleven that sells warm beer for $1 and venture into the fog. Down on the street, the fog seemed a lot further away than it seemed upstairs, looking down on it. Still, I wondered what it must be like inside it. There must be more visibility once you're inside it, I reasoned. Why is it so impenetrable from a distance? I thought, it's the future. Why don't I just Google it? Then resolved to probably go ahead and do just that. Later. After I got the beer, I walked east, looking off in the distance at the fog. I remained as conscious of it as I could, yet never noticed once I had entered it. I only became aware that I must be in it when I turned around and could no longer see my building behind me. As I walked toward my friend's place, the streets started to look more run down and the cars a lot older, although I had to admit some of them were still in pretty good condition. I thought how weird it was. Everyone on the entire block seemed to own cars from the 1970s. Maybe they were filming a movie on this block? Maybe this was movie fog, I wondered, before dismissing the thought. If this was movie fog, their fog machine must have mated with a nuclear bomb to cause an explosion of this much of it. This really tall lady started walking directly toward me. I moved to my left and right, and she just headed straight for me anyway. Then I swear she put her hands on my shoulders and propositioned me right there. She laughed at my expression, which must have had a bit of surprise in it, then informed me her room was right upstairs and gave me her priceless. I seized the moment to walk around her and shouting, "No thank you," sped down the block, putting as much distance as I could between myself and this lady as I could manage as quickly as possible. Was that for real? I thought back and reminded me of the street hookers they used to have out in front of McDonald's on the Upper West Side in the 70s, but this was Chelsea, or Gramercy Park. I'm not sure quite actually what neighborhood I was officially walking through, but I had never been propositioned this far east and south before. Well, it certainly could be a conversation starter when I got to Al's, I reasoned. I walked another 2 blocks and realized I must have gone past his place, so I doubled back. Once again I passed it without noticing, and then I realized it was because his building was actually not there. In the spot where my friend's building should have been was a construction site. A freaking construction site! I looked up and down and couldn't find any street signs in the fog. Wanted to make sure I was on the right block. I had to walk back to the corner again to view the street signs, but when I did, I discovered that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The only problem was that my friend's building wasn't. I felt really sick in my stomach, but I told myself I was just confused and I should call Al on the phone so we could figure it out together. Pulling out my cell phone, I tried to make a call to Al, but it wasn't going through. The phone had no signal. This was seriously not funny anymore, and I just walked home. I remember I put Black Flag damaged on my phone and turned it up to prevent me thinking about what was happening. I always feel less scared when that album is playing, so I guess that's why I resorted to it here. On the way back, things were relatively uneventful, but I did see other people who seemed to be freaking out like me. One of them was a tween-age girl dressed in a Justin Bieber t-shirt. The other was a pretty young lady in a poodle skirt and 50s hairdo. Was she a performer in a burlesque show, or was she lost in time as I felt like I was? I focused on the lyrics of the Black Flag songs and blocked out my growing suspicion that the entire world was insanity itself. And then I was home, just like that. My phone started blowing up with calls and texts that had been coming from Al demanding his beer. It turns out 3 hours had passed since I left my apartment. It only felt like maybe 20 minutes or a half hour to me. I called and told Al what happened. He called me a liar. Well, actually, he called me things I won't repeat here, some of which implied he felt I was lying. He said there was no prostitution on his block in the 70s, so I should stop making up stories. I asked him when he had moved to that neighborhood, and he had to admit he didn't move there until the 1990s, so he really wouldn't know if there were prostitutes there. Over the course of the next few months, I talked to some older people who knew the neighborhood from way back. One person remembered streetwalkers standing in the doorways in the 80s and 90s over on Madison, but not on the block I was on in the fog that day. So I really have no corroboration, but it hasn't been disproven either. And I never saw that lady again on that block or on any other. Needless to say, Al still to this day is convinced that this is all something I made up to screw with his perception of reality. I'm actually flattered he thinks that. It means he thinks I'm far more intellectual than I really am. I don't try to convince him that this story is true any longer, but on the other hand, I no longer offer to visit him on foggy days. Foggy Memory is told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. River. I'm the guy who told you about the story of the fog in New York City seeming to take me and some other places back in time, or maybe to an alternate reality. I mentioned in that one that I had another story about the fog that's actually scarier than the first one. This is that second story. Okay, as I said the last time, I live in a tall building on the west side of Manhattan. I am not the youngest person, and I have had several careers already. This now is one of the times when I'm between careers, and I recently got a job interview in a building that I can actually see from my bedroom window. The meeting was to take place on one of the very top floors of the building, which fascinated me. I had to wait 2 days before the meeting, and I would stare out of my bedroom window at the building's upper floors, wondering what they looked like inside. Would my visit there be my only time ever in the building, or would I get hired, and might that become one of the places where I spent most of my time? Either way, I knew I would still see it out my bedroom window every single day, and for whatever reason, I found that endlessly, weirdly fascinating. So on the morning of the interview, you can imagine my shock when I looked out the window in the direction of the building and saw nothing. At first it really gave my heart a jolt, and I wondered if I were still sleeping, but then it dawned on me that it was just an exceptionally foggy morning. Since this happened a short while after the story I told last time, realizing that it was only fog didn't really make me feel much better. Once again, I would be walking into the New York City fog. By the time I got out of the shower and was drinking my coffee, the fog had let up a bit, so I could see the bottom half of the building I had my appointment in. As my gaze lifted skyward, though, my entire body shuddered as the upper floors simply faded away in the fog and were completely invisible. Stop acting like a child, I thought, and then I realized I'd said it out loud. Looking at my phone, I saw it was time to go, so I went. Reaching the building by foot took 10 minutes less than I had expected, so I stood there looking up and realizing the top floors weren't any more visible from here than they had been from home. Still, my appointment was on the 23rd floor, and I had better clear the fog out of my mind in every sense that one can possibly mean that. I thought about getting a coffee from the guy on the corner, but my hands were already a bit shaky from nerves, and I didn't think a second cup of caffeine would be the best ingredient to add to the mix at the moment. Better 10 minutes early than 10 minutes late, I reminded myself in my father's voice, and I headed into the building to search for the elevator bank. It turned out this place had a few of them. I didn't count, but at least 3 or 4. I think some only went to the even floors and some to the odd floors, different sets of each or something. I wandered back and forth looking for the elevator that went to the 23rd floor but couldn't find it. The highest floor I could find was 15. That made no sense. Why would there be so many elevator banks if there were only 15 floors? Yes, this was an older building, but still, it made no sense. I got to the front of the elevator banks and decided to turn around and double-check where I had just been. Only now there was a wall directly behind me, and only the one set of elevators directly next to me. This again made no sense, and I stood there staring at the shocked expression on the face of my reflection in the marble wall. I don't know how long I stood there until a gentleman from security came up to me and politely asked if he could help me. I started asking which elevator went to the 23rd floor, but could tell by his reaction that there was no 23rd floor, and he thought I was crazy. I let my question trail off, and I walked out of the building and back home in some sort of a state of shock. I got back to my bedroom and stared at the building, with the top of it ascending into the fog. What the hell was going on? I looked through my Craigslist bookmarks and couldn't find the listing for this job. I searched for it on the site using all the keywords that should have brought it up. I wanted to double-check the address, but couldn't find evidence that the job offered it ever existed other than my handwritten notes. I called the phone number of the office, which was still programmed into my phone. It just rang and rang with nobody answering. The next morning, the fog had lifted, and to my horror, the building was now shorter than it had been before. It must have been 15 floors max, not 25, as it had been 2 days earlier. Feeling overcome by the stress of this nonsensical turn of events, I tried to forget about it and turned on the TV to catch up on the shows I'd been recording. I put on Svengoolie, and he was showing The House of Frankenstein. The characters were enveloped in a white fog, and the pretty young lady said, "It's like being wrapped in the arms of a gigantic ghost." I shuddered and turned the TV off. Obviously, this fog story troubles me. Now I am left to wonder whether the fog in New York has some dangerous supernatural element to it that it has chosen to reveal to me and me alone, or whether, perhaps, I may have already gone completely and irrevocably insane. Snow Devils, as told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. Ribber. I'm a 24-year-old male living in a large city. When I was 22, I had a girlfriend, a cat, and a mediocre day job. One of the reasons I hadn't gotten a better job was that I had a really nice boss, this lady in her early 60s who was kind to me. When my girlfriend abruptly moved out, I was emotionally devastated, and my boss noticed something was wrong. She talked me into explaining the situation to her, that my girlfriend dumped me for a rich guy and that I wasn't going to have enough to make the rent. She surprised me by suggesting I go live rent-free in her cabin up in the woods, and she'd send me work to do via the internet so she could justify continuing to pay me my old salary. Then I could get my head together while saving up to be able to afford to get a place to live again. I didn't drive, so I had to get a car service to drive me and Herbert the cat the 2.5 hours it took to reach the place. For the last 45 minutes, it started to snow, the first snow I had seen that year. Somehow the snow calmed me, and I looked forward to decompressing, remembering what it was like to just be me. I couldn't wait to stop thinking for a while and just be. After we got there, I partially unpacked, searched around for where she said the food would be, and then crashed out. When I woke up, it was morning. I dug through my stuff and found Herbie's breakfast, feeding him before looking for some cereal for myself. I got some almond milk out of the freezer, but realized it would need to thaw, so I sat by the window, eating frosty flakes out of the box with my hand. It was still snowing, even harder than when I had gone to sleep. By now the snow had covered the ground entirely, from the house back to the tree line. I could see that no person or animal had walked on the snow yet. If Bigfoot comes to visit us, we'll know it from his footprints in the snow, I told Herbert, who ignored me and climbed into my lap for his morning rub-down. I pet the cat and watched the snow, which fell and fell and fell, floating left and right and up and down, before eventually landing and landing and landing. It mesmerized me. And before long, my eyes must have glazed over worse than the worst couch potato. When I saw the thing moving under the snow, I had to rub my eyes for a while to be able to focus on it. A mound of something under the snow seemed to be moving, like a lump moving under the snow, not leaving a trail. The lump moved forward, and the snow still appeared virgin behind it. How could that be? What could do that? I stared for a while longer, but the lump didn't move again, so I started to wonder if my eyes were tricking me. I resolved to make myself some coffee and do some light exercise to wake up, so that is what I did. After some sit-ups, some push-ups, and jumping jacks, I grabbed my tablet and decided to see if the boss lady's Wi-Fi was as great as she bragged to me that it was. I went over to the same window, but before I could even sit down, I noticed there were now more lumps in the snow than I had noticed before. The one that had seemed to move was still there, but now there were, let me count in my head, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 6 or 7 more. But it was snowing so incredibly hard now that the visibility was maybe 10 feet, and I was pretty certain the lumps extended into the distant past where I could see. What the hell were they? I got the Wi-Fi working and Googled for lumps in snow and moving snow lump, but all I got in return was a how to make snowmen with glowing eyes tutorial. After a while, I found myself back to staring out at the snow. Time passed quickly, and Herbert had to alert me to the fact that it was now the evening and time for his dinner. I fed him, and feeling a chill, opened the flue and started a nice, warm fire. I wasn't hungry, but sat there by the window, eating frosty flakes by hand again and staring at the snow, wondering if I would see it move again. I guess I must have fallen asleep because I woke up suddenly to the sound of glass breaking. I stood up, and the cereal which had been on my lap spread all over the floor, mixing with the shards of broken glass. I looked up and saw that the bottom pane in the window had been smashed open, and a little white rat thing was trying to get inside. I ran back to the fireplace to grab a poker and fight off the white rat thing when it got inside and jumped to the floor. It stood up on its hind legs, and I could see it wasn't a rat at all. It was man-shaped but rat-sized. It was covered in snow, so I couldn't make out if it had any features. Herbie stalked over to it, furs standing on end and growling weird cat noises at it. The thing suddenly had a knife and charged at my cat, who screeched and walked backwards quickly. It stabbed and stabbed at Herbie, almost hitting him a couple times. I flipped out and kicked the thing into the wall. One of its arms broke off, but it immediately rose and charged me. I kicked again, and this time it landed directly in the fire. The thing sounded like frying water and screamed like a dying thing screams. I looked into the fire to see what was under the snow, but it just seemed to melt and leave nothing behind. How could it be made of ice? No organs or skeleton? That made no sense. I stared for a while uncomprehendingly, then jumped in the air when a new sound came from the window. Another of these things was trying to get in. I raced to the glass and pushed the mini monster back outside with my fireplace poker. As I did so, I noticed movement of several snow lumps outside, and then the window was barraged by a torrent of small rocks and ice balls being hurled at it, breaking 2 more panes. The tiny snowmen charged the window, with 2 getting in for each one I threw back out. While I was still trying to prevent them getting in, they'd begun climbing my pants legs and climbing up toward my face. I could easily defeat any of them, or even 2 or 3 of them, but within a minute I was swarmed by dozens of these things, stabbing at me with icicle knives from my ankles up to my face. I couldn't grab more than 1 or 2 at a time, and they'd each get replaced multiple times as I did so. I realized I was losing the battle, so I fell to the floor sharply, trying to crush them under my back and legs, then rolling over. As I did this, their knives only drove in more deeply, and I screamed in pain and fury. I stuck my feet in the fire, and the ones clinging on there died screaming, melting deaths. Quickly, I pulled my sweater off and flung that too into the fire. I did the same with my pants. The cabin was filled with the high-pitched screams of agony, even as I got on my cell phone and called the local authorities. By the time the sheriff's assistants showed up, I had gotten dressed and boarded the window up again using plywood and nails I found exactly where my boss said the tools were kept. I told the police the whole story, and they pointed out to me that nobody had come to the cabin that day. I told them the creatures came under the snow, and they just gave me a look and repeated it would have been impossible for anyone to have come to the cabin and attacked me. "Are you saying I broke the window myself and stabbed myself all over?" I asked them, incredulously. "I don't know what broke the window, sir," the deputy began, "but I'd guess that had something to do with you getting cuts all over yourself." This made me furious. "That's it? That's the entirety of your investigation?" "If you'd like, sir, we can drive you to the hospital and they can perform a toxicology test on you." Toxicology? You think I'm on drugs? I was raising my voice now. "Do you think your current behavior seems sober, sir?" I calmed down, seeing it from their point of view for the first time. "I guess not," I admitted. Still, I had to get out of that place and ask the cops if they could drop me and Herbie off at the rail station in town so we could head back to the city. They agreed most readily, clearly happy to get me out of their jurisdiction. I got back to the city and started working 2 jobs to keep that apartment until I could find a new roommate. The rest of the year was an utter hell, and I can barely remember any of it because it featured little other than work and stress. But eventually I did find a new roommate, who I still live with. I found a better job, which now, after a couple of promotions, pays better than both my old jobs combined. I don't have a new steady girlfriend yet, but I've just begun dating, and I am not in a rush as far as that goes. I did hear that my ex got dumped by the guy she dumped me for, and I admit that gave me a chuckle and helped me to get my head back together a bit. I still don't understand what happened to me out at my ex-boss's cabin. Was it my imagination reacting to stress? Had I lost my mind and broken the window myself? Or are there really creatures born of the ice and snow themselves? Creatures with no internal organs or bones, made entirely of water and memory? To this day, I can no longer enjoy the winter. While others marvel at the beauty of the snow, my eyes track the surface, looking for anomalies and bumps. I've never seen the snow move again like I saw that day, but I still know that it can. So I'll continue to be on guard for my life against the same snow you all think is so beautiful. I don't care if they call me insane. I'm still going to tell you, watch out. Watch out for the snow devils. They'll take what you think is beautiful and turn it into violence. They'll rob you of your innocence and maybe your life. Beware the snow devils and beware of snow.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary. Come back for more scary stories.